Millions of people are experiencing the most sophisticated psychological manipulation in human history, and they're paying for it. What took the ancient Greeks decades to understand about human desire, Silicon Valley cracked in under 5 years. And they used it to rewire an entire generation's relationship with the most fundamental human drive. If you've ever wondered why dating feels broken, why relationships feel impossible, or why you feel simultaneously overstimulated and completely empty, this isn't an accident. This is architecture. Here's the hard truth nobody wants to face. We've created the first generation in human history where the shadow of lust has been artificially amplified and weaponized against our own psychological development. And the victims aren't just individuals, it's the entire fabric of how we form intimate human connections. Jung warned us about this exact phenomenon in 1912. He called it the problem of the modern soul. When a culture becomes so disconnected from its deeper psychological needs that it begins consuming substitutes that ultimately poison the very thing they're seeking. The numbers are staggering. The average person now encounters more sexualized imagery in a single day than their great-grandparents saw in a lifetime. Dating apps generate over $8 billion annually by keeping people single and searching. The modern mind processes more sexual stimuli in 1 hour of scrolling than medieval humans experienced in months. But here's what's really happening beneath the surface. We're not dealing with liberation. We're dealing with the systematic hijacking of one of the most powerful psychological forces in human existence, the drive that Jung called the creative fire of the psyche. And when that fire gets corrupted, it doesn't just burn relationships, it burns souls. Every ancient culture understood something we've forgotten. Lust isn't just sexual desire, it's the shadow side of eros, the life force itself. The Greeks had a word for this, epithumia, burning desire that, when unintegrated, becomes a destructive force that consumes everything it touches. Plato warned us in the Phaedrus that the soul has 2 horses, one noble and one base. The noble horse represents love that ascends toward truth and beauty. The base horse represents desire that drags us toward consumption and illusion. The charioteer, our rational mind, must learn to control both horses, or we become slaves to whichever is stronger. Jung saw this same Platonic wisdom through a psychological lens. He understood that when we fail to integrate our shadow, the parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge, it doesn't disappear. It gets projected outward and becomes a compulsion that controls us from the unconscious. The technology companies didn't set out to destroy romance. They set out to monetize attention. But in doing so, they accidentally activated the most powerful psychological pattern in human history, the addiction cycle that turns sacred desire into profane consumption. This isn't a moral lecture. This is a psychological autopsy of how an entire generation got trapped in what Jung would call a complex, an autonomous psychological pattern that operates independently of conscious will. And once you see the architecture of this trap, you can never unsee it. Let's confront the shadow directly. Right now, some of you are feeling resistance to this message. Your mind might be saying, this is just conservative fear-mongering, or sexual liberation is progress, or I'm in control of my desires. That resistance, that's not you talking. That's the complex defending itself. Here's how the manipulation works. Every swipe, every like, every match triggers a dopamine release that's carefully calibrated to be just rewarding enough to keep you coming back, but never satisfying enough to make you stop. This isn't accidental, it's operant conditioning, the same principle used to train laboratory rats. But here's where it gets psychologically devastating. The brain can't distinguish between digital sexual stimuli and real sexual opportunity. Every time you see an attractive person on your phone, your neural pathways fire as if you're encountering a potential mate. Your body floods with the same neurochemicals our ancestors experienced when meeting someone they could actually connect with. But there's no real connection, no actual intimacy, no genuine vulnerability, just an endless parade of digital phantoms that trigger your deepest biological drives while delivering nothing but psychological junk food. The result? Your brain's reward system gets hijacked. Real relationships start to feel boring, slow, inadequate. Why invest in getting to know one person when you could swipe through hundreds? This is how lust, the sacred fire of human connection, gets corrupted into consumption. And once that happens, you don't relate to people anymore. You consume them. Still think you're in control? But wait, there's something even more sinister happening here. Something that goes deeper than technology, deeper than algorithms, deeper than corporate manipulation. What if I told you that this entire phenomenon, the hypersexualization of culture, the commodification of intimacy, the transformation of relationships into transactions, what if this isn't new at all? The philosopher Oswald Spengler predicted this exact pattern in The Decline of the West. He observed that every great civilization follows the same trajectory, from heroic culture to decadent civilization. In the final phase, what he called the megalopolis stage, societies lose their connection to transcendent meaning and become obsessed with sensation and immediate gratification. Spengler wrote, "The last man of the world city no longer wants to live. He may cling to life as an individual, but as a type, as an aggregate, no, for it is a characteristic of this collective existence that it eliminates the terror of death." Jung studied this same pattern across cultures and throughout history. He called it the dissolution of the transcendent function, when a civilization loses its ability to integrate opposing forces and instead gets consumed by them. Every great civilization goes through this phase: Egypt, Rome, Babylon. The pattern is always the same. Sexual energy becomes disconnected from its spiritual source, gets weaponized by power structures, and ultimately consumes the culture that created it. But here's what's different about our time. For the first time in human history, this pattern isn't limited to a single culture or geographical region. It's global, and it's not happening over centuries, it's happening in real time, accelerated by technology. We're witnessing what Nietzsche prophesied as the last man, beings who have lost the capacity for great longing, for deep connection, for anything beyond immediate comfort and stimulation. As he wrote, "Alas, the time is coming when man will no longer give birth to a dancing star. Alas, the time of the most despicable man is coming, he that is no longer able to despise himself." But here's what's different about our time. For the first time in human history, this pattern isn't limited to a single culture or geographical region. It's global, and it's not happening over centuries. It's happening in real time, accelerated by technology. We're witnessing the first planetary-scale psychological manipulation experiment in human history. And the target isn't just individuals, it's the entire future of human intimate connection. But to understand how deep this goes, we need to look at what happened to the generation that came of age during this transformation. Let me paint you a picture of two different worlds, separated by just 20 years. World 1, 2005. You meet someone at a coffee shop, a party, through friends. There's mystery, uncertainty, you don't know everything about them from their social media profile. You can't swipe to see what other options exist. Your attention isn't being pulled in 15 different directions by people you'll never meet. When you're together, you're actually together. No phones, no constant comparison to an infinite marketplace of alternatives. Relationships had what Jung called the numinous quality. They felt sacred, special, set apart from ordinary experience. World 2, 2025. Before you even meet someone, you've already seen their carefully curated highlight reel. You know their body from multiple angles. You've mentally compared them to thousands of other profiles. You've probably been simultaneously talking to 5 other people who are doing the same thing. When you finally meet, you're both performing versions of yourselves optimized for consumption. You're both simultaneously present and absent, physically there, but psychologically elsewhere, wondering if someone better is just a swipe away. This generation didn't choose this. They were born into it. Their neural pathways were shaped by it. Their understanding of love, attraction, and intimacy was forged in this digital crucible. The human brain doesn't fully develop until age 25. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for impulse control, long-term thinking, and emotional regulation, is the last to mature. An entire generation had their sexual and romantic development hijacked during this critical period. They learned to associate love with anxiety, intimacy with performance, and commitment with limitation. They learned that people are interchangeable, that satisfaction is always just out of reach, and that the grass is always greener on the next profile. The psychological casualties are unprecedented. Depression rates among young adults have tripled. Anxiety disorders have become normalized. The number of people reporting feeling lonely has reached epidemic levels, even among those who are technically dating. But here's the cruelest irony. This is happening during what should be the most romantically fertile period of human history. We have more ways to connect than ever before, yet we've never been more disconnected. Now, here's where this gets really interesting and disturbing, because what we're dealing with isn't just technology addiction or social media manipulation. We're dealing with the systematic corruption of what Jung called the anima and animus. the inner masculine and feminine principles that guide how we relate to the opposite sex. But there's a deeper philosophical layer here. Arthur Schopenhauer, in The World as Will and Representation, argued that sexual desire is the strongest manifestation of what he called the will, the blind, irrational force that drives all existence. He wrote, "All love, however ethereally it may bear itself, is rooted in the sexual impulse alone." Schopenhauer understood that sexual attraction isn't personal. It's the species using individuals as instruments for its own perpetuation. But here's the crucial insight. When we become conscious of this process, we can either be enslaved by it or transcend it through what he called aesthetic contemplation, the ability to see beyond the veil of desire to the underlying reality. In healthy psychological development, Jung's anima and animus archetypes help us form realistic, mature relationships with actual human beings. These inner principles serve as psychological bridges that allow us to connect with the mystery and otherness of potential partners. But when these archetypes get corrupted by an endless stream of artificial stimuli, something devastating happens. Instead of being drawn to real people with real complexity, we become addicted to what Plato would call shadows on the cave wall, mere projections of our own unconscious desires. Men develop what Jung would call a contaminated anima. Their inner feminine becomes warped by pornographic imagery and impossible standards. They can no longer see real women clearly. Every interaction is filtered through a screen of unrealistic expectations and commodified sexuality. Women develop what we might call a hyperactive animus. Their inner masculine becomes dominated by validation-seeking and competitive display. They learn to perform sexuality rather than inhabit it, to optimize for attention rather than connection. The result is that men and women are no longer meeting each other as complete human beings. They're meeting as collections of projections, fantasies, and unmet psychological needs. This is why modern dating feels so exhausting. It's not really dating at all. It's mutual psychological masturbation, each person using the other as a screen for their own unintegrated desires. And the technology companies know this. They've weaponized the deepest insights of psychology to keep people trapped in this cycle. Because fulfilled people don't generate revenue, fulfilled people don't need apps. But here's what they didn't count on. The human psyche has its own intelligence, and it's starting to fight back. Something unexpected is happening. After 2 decades of hypersexualization and digital dating chaos, a counter-movement is emerging. And it's not coming from where you'd expect. Gen Z, the generation that was supposed to be the most sexually liberated in history, is actually having less sex than their parents. They're more likely to value long-term relationships, they're more skeptical of hookup culture. They're beginning to recognize that something essential has been stolen from them. This isn't moral conservatism. This is what Hegel would call the cunning of reason, the way historical forces work through apparent contradictions to achieve higher synthesis. Their unconscious minds are rejecting the poison they've been fed. Jung would call this the compensatory function, when the psyche automatically generates healing responses to psychological damage. But here's the fascinating part. They're not just rejecting modern dating culture, they're rediscovering what Søren Kierkegaard called the eternal in man, those timeless truths about love, commitment, and authentic existence that transcend cultural fashion. Kierkegaard distinguished between 3 stages of existence: the aesthetic, living for pleasure; the ethical, living by social rules; and the religious, living in authentic relationship with the eternal. This generation is beginning to understand that hookup culture trapped them in the aesthetic stage, endlessly pursuing novelty and sensation without ever achieving genuine fulfillment. They're beginning to understand what their great-grandparents knew intuitively, that sexuality without spirituality is empty, that pleasure without meaning is addiction, that freedom without boundaries is chaos. What Aristotle called akrasia, the weakness of will that leads us to act against our own deepest interests. This is the beginning of what Jung called the return of the transcendent function, the reunification of opposing forces that had been split apart. But the question remains, is it too late? Has an entire generation been so psychologically damaged that they can't recover the capacity for deep, meaningful relationships? The answer might surprise you. Here's the thing about the human brain that gives me hope. It's remarkably plastic. Even adult brains can rewire themselves when exposed to new patterns and experiences. The damage done by digital hyperstimulation isn't permanent, it's reversible. But the process of healing isn't what most people expect. It doesn't happen through more technology, more apps, or more optimization. It happens through what Jung called the process of individuation, becoming psychologically whole. For this generation, individuation means confronting the shadow of lust head-on. It means acknowledging how they've been manipulated, recognizing the false promises they've been sold, and choosing a different path forward. This starts with what I call digital detox individuation, deliberately breaking the addiction cycles that have been programmed into daily life. Not just taking breaks from apps, but fundamentally rewiring the relationship between stimulus and response. Stage 1. Shadow integration. Acknowledging the extent of the psychological manipulation, recognizing how lust has been weaponized against authentic intimacy, accepting responsibility for healing. Stage 2. Anima animus reconstruction. Deliberately exposing yourself to more realistic representations of the opposite sex, reading literature instead of scrolling feeds, having conversations instead of consuming content. Stage 3. Sacred sexuality reclamation. Understanding that sexual energy is creative energy, learning to channel desire toward meaningful connection rather than empty consumption. Stage 4. Relationship as spiritual practice. Approaching relationships not as entertainment or validation seeking, but as opportunities for mutual growth and psychological development. This isn't easy. The neural pathways of instant gratification run deep. The culture actively works against this kind of healing. Every day, you're bombarded with messages that try to pull you back into the consumption cycle. But here's what I've observed in people who successfully break free. They don't just recover their capacity for healthy relationships. They develop a depth of intimacy that previous generations couldn't even imagine. They become immune to the psychological manipulations that control everyone else. They discover what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing forces in creative tension rather than being torn apart by them. Let me tell you what it looks like when someone successfully breaks free from this psychological prison. First, they stop seeking external validation for their worth. The compulsive need to be desired by strangers disappears. They no longer need their phone to tell them they're attractive or lovable. Second, they develop what Jung called psychological containment, the ability to be present with one person without constantly wondering about alternatives. The grass is greener syndrome loses its power. Third, they rediscover the mystery and otherness of real human beings. Instead of seeing people as collections of attributes to be evaluated, they become curious about the actual person behind the surface. Fourth, they learn to transmute sexual energy into creative force. Instead of dissipating desire through endless consumption, they channel it into building something meaningful. But here's the most profound transformation. They stop being afraid of commitment. They realize that limitation isn't the enemy of freedom, it's the condition that makes freedom meaningful. They understand that choosing one person isn't about settling or missing out. It's about going deeper instead of wider. It's about discovering the infinite within the particular. This is what Jung meant by the union of opposites. The integration of desire and commitment, passion and stability, freedom and devotion. And when this happens, when someone successfully completes this psychological transformation, they become what I call relationship immune. They can't be manipulated by dating apps. They can't be seduced by artificial stimuli. They can't be convinced that the grass is greener elsewhere. They've found something that the modern world has forgotten. The difference between lust and love, between consumption and creation, between fantasy and reality. So here's where we stand. We're at a crossroads that will determine the future of human intimate connection. One path leads deeper into psychological fragmentation, digital addiction, and relational chaos. The other leads toward integration, authenticity, and meaningful connection. The choice isn't just personal, it's civilizational. Because if an entire generation remains trapped in the consumption cycle, we're not just talking about individual loneliness. We're talking about the breakdown of the family unit, the collapse of social cohesion, and the end of psychological development through intimate relationship. The numbers don't lie. Marriage rates are at historic lows. Birth rates are plummeting. More people report feeling lonely than ever before. This isn't just a trend, it's a civilizational crisis. But here's what gives me hope. Awareness is the first step toward healing, and more people are waking up to the reality of how they've been manipulated. The solution isn't to return to some imaginary golden age. It's to integrate the best of ancient wisdom with modern understanding, to use technology as a tool rather than being used by it, to reclaim our agency in the most fundamental area of human experience. This is your invitation to join the resistance. Not a political resistance, but a psychological one. A resistance against the forces that want to keep you trapped in cycles of consumption and dissatisfaction. It starts with a simple decision: to value depth over breadth, quality over quantity. reality over fantasy, connection over consumption. It continues with daily choices, to put down the phone during conversations, to resist the urge to check other options when you're with someone, to invest in understanding rather than being understood. And it culminates in what Jung called the achievement of wholeness, the integration of all parts of yourself into a coherent, authentic human being capable of genuine intimacy. We began with a hard truth. An entire generation has had their capacity for intimate connection systematically undermined by forces beyond their conscious awareness. Lust, the sacred fire of human creativity, has been weaponized against the very relationships it was meant to create. But we end with an even more powerful truth. The human psyche is remarkably resilient. What has been fragmented can be integrated. What has been corrupted can be purified. What has been lost can be reclaimed. The path forward isn't easy, but it's simple. Reject the substitutes, embrace the real, choose depth over surface, commit to the difficult work of psychological integration. You are not condemned to repeat the patterns that have trapped your generation. You have the power to break the cycle, to heal the wound, to reclaim your birthright as a human being capable of profound intimate connection. The choice is yours. Will you remain trapped in the consumption cycle, endlessly seeking satisfaction in digital fantasies and superficial connections? Or will you take the hero's journey toward psychological wholeness and authentic intimacy? The future of human connection depends on your answer. If this message resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more content about psychological healing and authentic relationship. And most importantly, start the work of integration in your own life. The revolution begins with you.